Every American generation has had to respond to foreign tyrants. The greatest generation stood up to Hitler and Stalin. The baby boomers grappled with Castro and Gaddafi. In his acclaimed book, The Age of the Strongman, author Gideon Rachman explores the modern challenge of tyranny. What makes a strongman? Why are we seeing a proliferation of such individuals across the globe? And what are the best ways to respond to the threats that they pose? I'm Michael Scharf. In today's broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, our panel, which includes the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, the Director of the International Bar Association, and the former Chief Prosecutor of an international criminal tribunal, will seek to answer these questions. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio program and podcast brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're talking about the challenges of responding to the proliferation of so-called strongmen leaders across the globe. Let me introduce today's expert guests. I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador Beth Van Schaak to our program for the very first time. Joining us from D.C., she is the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice at the U.S. Department of State. The ambassador will be participating in our conversation during the third segment. But for now, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our program. Beth?
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks.
Great to be here.
And joining us from across the Atlantic in London, England, is Dr. Mark Ellis, the Executive Director of the International Bar Association. He's been involved in the trials of Saddam Hussein, Slobodan Milosevic, and the leaders of the Khmer Rouge regime. Welcome back to our program, Mark.
Michael, it's great to be back. Thank you.
And joining our conversation from the mountains of Asheville, North Carolina, is David Crane, the former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. David is the author of the book Every Living Thing, Facing Down Terrorists, Warlords, and Thugs in West Africa. Thanks for being on our program, Dave.
It's my pleasure.
Joining us from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where he's on vacation, is Dr. Greg Noon, the director of the Fairmont State University National Security and Intelligence Program. A retired Navy JAG captain, Greg served as head of the International Law Branch at the Pentagon. Thanks for being with us today, Greg.
Thank you for having me back, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
And we are joined from Northern Virginia by Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize-nominated NGO. Paul has served as legal advisor in 24 peace negotiations and is the author of the new book, Lawyering Peace. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure.
And finally, sitting across from me in the IdeaStream studio in Cleveland, Ohio, is Dr. Shannon French, director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. Shannon is the author of the acclaimed book, The Code of the Warrior. Shannon, it is good to have you back on our show.
Great to be here, Michael.
So this is the way this will work. We have more people on the show than we usually do, but we're going to manage because they're all superb. In the first segment, we'll start with some background about the world's strongmen leaders. Next, we're going to discuss how strongmen come to power and retain it. And finally, we'll discuss how the international community can best respond to the threat that strongmen leaders pose. So Shannon French, let's start off with the definition. What exactly is a strongman leader?
Well, the key component is that they are authoritarian. They are usually nationalist, and they tend to be populist leaders. But another point that is not always obvious to people is they actually can be elected. But what matters is they don't have any meaningful opposition, often because their opposition is forcefully restrained by their actions and threats of force or use of force. And there are no checks and balances on their power that are effective.
All right, that gives us a good sense of what we're talking about. Let's turn to David Crane. David, as the chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, you grappled with a prototypical strongman leader, President Charles Taylor of Liberia. From that experience, Dave, what would you say are the tactics that strongman leaders use?
Well, as Shannon mentioned, and again, it's just great to be with all of you, my dear friends, is just, it's they reach power in different ways. A lot of them are elected by a popular vote, and that's really critical and of note, actually. But when they come to power, they begin to take on power, and as they take on that power, they realize that just having power does not satisfy the needs of a country. And so they always kind of look outward to a threat. I call it the boogeyman theory. In other words, there has to be something that this authoritarian figure, this strongman, has to, quote, protect the citizens from. A good example is the great Satan that Iran uses to galvanize the populace against the United States. And so this is almost all across the board. There's always an outside threat to allow them to maintain power. And I think that's really, really critical as we begin to discuss further, the idea and the concept of strongmen and how they're threatening democracies around the world.
And David, I suppose that these are perceived threats, and the strongmen use lies and disinformation to try to convince their population that the threat is real.
Well, yeah, it is. And if you go back, and I've studied strongmen pretty much half my professional life, yeah, they are, in some ways, they're mythical. Adolf Hitler turned on the Jews as an example of, quote, boogeymen who are rotting the society of Germany. And so he used them to galvanize the hate and fear of the German people against a, quote, common enemy. And that, ironically, consolidates power and causes people to gel in some form of fear and anger to take on whatever that external threat is. But they're usually not actual threats.
And Shannon, would you add any tactics to that list?
I would simply note, and this builds off what you were just pointing out there, David, they control the flow of information. They design the narrative, and they try to ensure that everything matches that narrative. And that also means, of course, that they actively silence their critics. So that's a tactic you see always with these strongmen.
All right, and I think they also tend to use violence, either at home or abroad.
So, or the threat of violence.
Yeah, or the threat of violence. Does anybody else want to add any tactic that we've left out?
I would like to just real quickly add also, they do really some crazy things with, quote, the rule of law. In some ways, they use the law to gain power, maintain power through whatever parliamentary system that they may have, the legislative branch that they may have, and all of the laws that bolster the power of the strongman are passed by really a legislature, but of course they're following the drum of the authoritarian figure. But in a lot of ways, what they're doing under their domestic law is, quote, legal, unquote.
So in today's world, the strongman we most focus on, I guess, is Vladimir Putin. Paul Williams, you and your NGO, the Public International Law and Policy Group, you've spent the past several months working to make Russian President Vladimir Putin accountable for the crime of aggression and war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Ukraine. Are you concerned that Putin is serving as a sort of role model for the new generation of strongmen leaders?
Oh, Michael, he is operating as the strongman, as well as essentially...
that must be your dog Scrappy back there, is that right?
We're very concerned that Putin is not only serving as a role model, but he's drafting the playbook of a strongman, as Shannon and David noted, by implementing disenfranchising the domestic opposition, bending the rule of law. But he's also manipulating international institutions that were designed to stop this from happening. And he's manipulating, quote unquote, the non-aligned movement into actually being aligned in some circumstances with him as a strongman. The good news is the international infrastructure is pushing back with account investigations and general public and international outcry against his actions. So he's got a playbook, but fortunately, there's a counter playbook on the table as well.
And we're going to be talking about that in the third segment. But for now, I want to ask Greg Noon, from your long military career, who else besides Putin would you say are today's most threatening strongmen leaders? And can you tell us about each of the people that you mentioned?
Yeah, Michael, unfortunately, your show is only an hour. So I'll try to be as brief as possible because really the list is growing, right? I mean, we talked about Putin, China's Xi, who has a very aggressive posture diplomatically and militarily and just entered an unprecedented third term. Of course, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Orban in Hungary, who has, again, taken a democracy and abused the power that he was given through a proper election in his ability to distribute state resources and kind of break not just the law, but break the norms. And this is a lot of what we're talking about, break the norms that have existed as guardrails. And then, of course, Erdogan in Turkey, some argue Netanyahu in Israel with his attempt to curtail the Supreme Court's powers there, and on and on. So you have a long list on a spectrum. They're not all the same. Some are much more murderous, violent, villains here, and others are doing it for their own personal power and filling up their bank account. But nonetheless, there is, as David Crane mentioned, they're protecting us from some threat, which usually means violence is involved at some level.
When you mentioned Erdogan in Turkey, I'm reminded that it's been about 10 years since Paul Williams and I were tear-gassed when we were near Taksim Square, and Erdogan had the military attack protesters that just happened to be near where we were. And Paul and I ran like the bulls at Popluma. So, Paul, let me ask you, is there anyone else besides those that Greg mentioned that you would add to this rogues gallery of autocrats?
Yeah, Michael, unfortunately, I think, even these last few months, we could add a number of individuals to this rogues gallery. There's recently a coup in Niger. There's an emerging situation in Senegal with the opposition party being outlawed. There's an emerging situation in Bangladesh with tension with the opposition. Sudan, we have Hamedi from the Janjaweed militia, Burhan from the Sudanese Armed Forces. You look at South Sudan, both the governing party and the opposition party fit into the categories that Greg just described. And quite frankly, a number of our allies in the Gulf probably fit into this category of autocrats as well.
And let me turn to Shannon. I couldn't fail to notice that all of the authoritarian leaders that have been mentioned so far are men. Is that a coincidence, or does it tell us something about gender leadership styles?
Well, actually, I'm going to have to disagree with you there, Michael, because I think we have had women who are strong men, so to speak. A classic example would be Indira Gandhi. Mm-hmm. More current, Aung San Suu Kyi. Unfortunately, people used to see her in a very different light, but now I think she could be classed as a strong man, including the Rohingya genocide. And of course, if you go further back in time, you have figures like Queen Elizabeth I, who, asked her cousin Mary how much of a strong woman she was, or Catherine the Great of Russia. I guess my point would be it isn't gendered. No. Absolute power corrupts any gender.
Just this week, I was reading some newspaper articles about Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who has undertaken a number of strongman tactics in Italy as the new prime minister. So it's good to hear that this is a gender-neutral problem.
Unfortunately.
Let's explore the problem in more detail when we come back from our break. When we return, we'll talk about how strongmen attain and retain power. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy. brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media, heard quarterly here on 89.7 WKSU. I'm Michael Scharf, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today from London, England, by the Executive Director of the International Bar Association, Mark Ellis. From Washington, D.C., by Ambassador Beth Van Schaak. From North Carolina, by the former Chief Prosecutor of an International Criminal Tribunal, David Crane. From Cape Cod, by the former head of the Pentagon's International Law Branch, Greg Noon. And from Northern Virginia, by the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams. Here in the studio with me is the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence, Shannon French. In this segment of our show, we're going to be discussing how strongmen come to power and stay in power. But before we do, I want to ask a question of Greg Noon. In the book, The Age of the Strongman, Gideon Rachman suggests that Donald Trump could be considered a strongman leader. Now, we've been talking about all these other strongman leaders across the globe. Greg Noon, what do you think the case is, both for and against, thinking about Trump in that way?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Obviously, a very divisive question. We're going to evoke a divisive answer. I mean, people see him in varying likes. I mean, his supporters think that he's protecting the country, that he's saving us from what David Crane mentioned, these perceived threats, and these threats to our way of life, our existence as America. And then his detractors say that he aspires to be a strongman. The only person he literally has never insulted is Putin. He's insulted veterans and the disabled, et cetera, et cetera. But he would really love to have a massive military parade, and fosters this cult of personality. And elections are rigged unless, of course, I win. And this conspiratorial deep state that is going to try to thwart his moves as he sticks up for real Americans. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of books for the next 20, 30, 50 years about Donald Trump as the classic strongman. And then you're going to see a number of books on the other side that are going to talk about how he was the savior and he was the best thing that ever happened to America. So it will continue to be divisive long after he's off the scene.
Now, Mark Ellis, even though you're out there in London, England, I should note that you are an American from Florida. Do you want to weigh in on that?
I think Greg covered that. I just want to, again, my point is, I think for me is that I look at Trump. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I should say that at the start. But I think he's more of a wannabe autocrat. As Greg says, he admires those like Putin or Xi, and he's not yet achieved that status. And I think this is really important to mention, and Shannon alluded to it earlier. It's because at least in the United States at this time, we have counterbalancing structural and constitutional forces that I think deter strongmen. I hope they last. I hope they continue to survive. But right now, I think that's what has kept Trump from this mantle that he would like to be on. So he might be a nationalist, or he probably is a nationalist. He's certainly a populist, but not yet, in my mind, a strongman.
Okay, I would just add to what Mark was saying.
That's
is
Greg.
That a second term, he has plans. And he knows what he needs to do differently. He's not going to bring in the General Mattises and General Kellys and other what he considers institutionalized actors that will put up guardrails. He has plans to take decisive and thorough action if elected to a second term.
Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about our own problems with strongmen in the United States, I want to step back and get some historic context and ask a question of Mark Ellis. So, Mark, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, many people believed that the combination of free markets and democratic institutions and the rule of law had proved so irresistibly successful that the world would progress inexorably in that direction. But instead, I think we can say that we've witnessed the collapse of the post-Cold War consensus into a new age of authoritarian dictatorship. So what went wrong?
Wow, that is a question. And it's personal to me, Michael, because I was actually in Berlin. I was in East Berlin in the exact week that the Berlin Wall fell, and subsequently was involved with 10 years of kind of providing technical assistance to the region. So I feel quite emotional about that region and what happened afterwards. And I think we can all agree that, at least for Europe, that fall of the Berlin Wall was, one of history's most profound political transformations. But I think for that region, and this is true elsewhere, embedding those political changes and kind of these democratic principles, they take several generations. And I think what happened in Eastern Europe and what happens in some kind of post-conflict countries is that the countries never really truly transition into democracies. And free elections do not guarantee democracy. So this initial euphoria, I think, after 1989, I think kind of gave way to the disillusionment as the kind of the implementation of political and economic reforms. They brought hardship to people. And so I think this led to people being skeptical about democracy, and I think that viewpoint is prevalent today. But I do hope and I do think that we'll always witness the ebb and flow of democracies. I think that's just part of history. And I think in the long run, democracies will hold. And I think oftentimes we just have to be patient. And I think that will be the case in the former Eastern Europe as we see what happens.
And I think the United States played a very positive role in that process. But to be fair, our role is sometimes mixed. So let me ask Shannon French, what role did government grievances against U.S. foreign intervention or globalism or international monetary policy play in the rise of some of these strongmen?
Well, unfortunately, as it was mentioned before, these authoritarian leaders love to have an external threat that they can identify and focus their people on so that their people will not use that same energy for internal unrest. And we feed their narrative when we do these interventions. They can put us in that role as a threat. And I would add to that only that, unfortunately, too, it means that sometimes our hands are tied in terms of giving support to opposition parties, because if we were to do so, we actually can accidentally make them look like a puppet of the U.S., which then just, again, feeds the authoritarians' narrative.
And let me think back to that list of strongmen that we were talking about. There were people from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. Mark Ellis, do you think that certain countries or certain regions of the world are predisposed to strongmen leaders?
No, not at all. I don't think there's any geographical difference or predisposition to strongmen rulers. But I do think that among these kind of diverse countries, you're mentioning a number of regions where these strongmen flourish, there are common attributes. And I think these have been alluded to earlier. You look at those regions or the countries where all of a sudden there's no freedom of speech or assembly, there's no free press or media, there's no independent judiciary to counter the strongmen rule. And these governments, as has been alluded to, tend to rule by terror instead of reason. So I think there's also this kind of general, as I mentioned, after fall of the Berlin Wall, there's at times a dissatisfaction with democracies. And I have no doubt that that's exasperated by the rise of use of social media. But I think there's real concern here, because when you look at the surveys that are coming out now, particularly in North America and Europe, people have grown more cynical about the value of democracy as a political system, and they're more willing to support authoritarian models. This is a real concern.
And this is sobering. Let me ask Greg Noon a different type of question. Greg, do you think that today's strongmen leaders have anything in common? Personalities, personal histories. Do their personalities tell us more, perhaps, than their political systems or their economic structures about why they have attained power?
Yeah, I think that personality matters a great deal. In the thinking of this program today, I think the one word I would sum it up with is they're daring. they're daring to do things that for long time, especially in a democracy, where people would say, "Oh no, no one would ever do that," or "No, that's just not possible," and yet they do it, and then they kind of wait for a reaction, and depending on what type of reaction they receive, they'll either push it further or they'll push back with their own lying, denying, and counter accusations. But then the other thing that I would add, you mentioned political, economic, history. Yeah, I think you have to add cultural. A lot of this, Orban, Trump, Putin, they're all playing a cultural instrument here to try to rally people to believe that they're the true holders of the right culture for our country.
And I should mention that Greg is not just an expert at military affairs, but he has his doctorate in political science, which I think does entitle you to opine on that. Let me turn to another PhD on our panel. That's Paul Williams, the head of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Paul, you were talking about the playbook of the tactics of strongmen before. Is there also a sort of playbook on how they come to power?
Well, yes, Michael. I think the very first edition of the playbook really only had 2 chapters, one of which was to put on a military uniform and have a coup. The second chapter was essentially inheriting it through royal succession. But I think in the second edition of the playbook, we're finding that one of the paths is to become democratically elected and then erode the institutional structures, the rule of law, muddy transparency, and essentially create a political culture. And I think this is what Greg was hinting at, is if you can create a political culture which essentially minimizes the moderates in the middle and only leaves room for political discourse on 2 extremes, it's us or them. And that's incredibly fertile ground for the emergence and the continuation of a strongman in a political situation.
And David Crane, as the former prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone who prosecuted Charles Taylor, you saw how he rose to power. What would you add to Paul's description of the strongman's playbook? Is there a chapter 3 or 4 you want to add in?
Well, it's interesting. I love Paul's description of the editions kind of thing. There are variations on the theme, but they tend to wrap themselves in a grievance. They wrap themselves around nationalism. They play to the nationalistic bent of peoples. There's that famous picture, literally, of Donald Trump hugging the American flag. That could be anybody else, any of the other strongmen around the world, past and present. They do the same thing. They take the past and bring it forward, whatever grievance that had happened. Obviously, Adolf Hitler brought forward World War I, the armistice, how it was jammed down Germany's throat. We have lots to do. We've got to make Germany great again. Those kind of things get people listening, and then he turns on and then he looks into the reason for all of these problems, and that is that, as I mentioned earlier, the boogeyman who has created these issues, such as the Jews, the Bolsheviks, etc., the great Satans. And if you look at each of these strong men, they're always pointing to somebody externally. But again, they wrap themselves in their flags to get people stirred up. They make it a great movement, and that gets things going. But again, we really have to understand that a lot of them use their laws through their legislatures to really get specifically in power and then stay in power, and then here we go. They institutionalize themselves using democratic principles that dissolve very, very quickly once they maintain complete power.
So let me ask Mark Ellis, the executive director of the International Bar Association, a question. In today's world, you have to have a lot of money to attain power, especially in democratic states. And the strongman leaders tend to be among the richest individuals in the world. So, Mark, do Western financial centers share some of the responsibility for the rise of these strongman leaders by helping them launder their ill-gotten gains?
Yeah, this has to be a new chapter in Paul's playbook because the answer is absolutely yes. I think corruption plays a major role. Some would say the major role in sustaining the position of these strongmen. And so, yeah, financial lenders share responsibility. I mean, we all remember when Russia annexed the Crimea in 2014. Not only was the international community's response, I think, rather muted, but pretty quickly it was Western countries that continued to finance Putin, support him, particularly with Russia's oil pipeline into Western Europe. So I think Western financial centers play a significant role in enabling oligarchs and strongmen to flourish. And they do this by really creating, I think, a real favorable environment for the flight of the wealth of these strongmen. I was reading where there's $7.5 trillion currently held in tax havens, representing 8% of the world's global financial wealth. The vast majority of that share comes from in hidden assets from autocratic regimes, and this is the issue. And I think, Michael, it's important, since we're lawyers here, to understand that this transfer of wealth and the corruption that takes place, it's supported by banks, it's supported by professionals like lawyers that can establish these shell companies, the trust, the secret vehicles that allow strongmen to shield their assets. And finally, which I've always found to be the saddest part, we welcome them. We give a warm welcome to strongmen, particularly their families, allowing them to acquire real estate through trust or shell companies, as I say, and even enrolling their children in prestigious educational institutions. So yes, bottom line is, I think the West and Western financial centers have a responsibility in what's happening.
And in the next segment, we can talk about how we might change all of that. It is time for another break. When we return, we're going to talk about how the United States should best respond to foreign tyrants. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts on foreign policy, military policy, international law, and international diplomacy. In this final segment of our program, we're going to be discussing the threat posed by the strongman phenomenon and the prescription for countering that threat. But before we jump into that, I want to ask Paul Williams a final question about the mentality of strongmen. And that is, Paul, we tend to see stories in the Western press describing the strongmen leaders as mentally ill. A common diagnosis is narcissistic personality disorder. Paul, is this just a tactic to discredit the strongmen, or would you say it's possibly an accurate assessment of their psychological condition?
Well, Michael, in order to answer that question, I'd have to reach back to my Psychology 101 textbook from my freshman years as an undergrad and remind myself of Freud's teachings and thinkings. But actually, I'm going to go off the board for points and go with Machiavelli. I think this is about power, and unfortunately, I think it's very common in human nature to desire power, wealth, political influence, and creating a family legacy. A lot of our strongmen have strong children as well. So I would think it's more Machiavellian mindset than a narcissistic mindset.
And would you say that, the U.S., for example, uses this as a propaganda tool because the strongmen are seen as our enemies, so let's discredit them by saying, look, they're just crazy?
I think we use it as a tool to erode the moral imperative for us to take effective action. Because if they're crazy, there's nothing we can do about it. But no, if they're actually being Machiavellian, you can take Machiavelli as the prince, turn it upside down, and you have your counter playbook for eroding their wealth, limiting their political limiting their political power. And as Mark Ellis pointed out, putting constraints on the way in which they can pass their wealth and power to their family members. No, it's an excuse for us not doing the hard work that is necessary to box in and constrain strongmen and their consequences.
Yeah. And Shannon French is an internationally renowned ethicist. What would you add to that?
Well, I would add two quick points. One, even if they are narcissists, that doesn't diminish their responsibility at all. So it's not the kind of mental health condition that gives you any pass. Lots of people are narcissists. They're still accountable for everything they do. But the other key point I would make is that some people try to suggest that these strong men are geniuses, that they're playing 3D chess and all this. There's very little evidence of this. The majority of them are not particularly bright. What they do is they surround themselves with yes men who tell them that they're smart, tell them that they're good. And this is a valuable weakness from our point of view because it means that they make mistakes and no one corrects them. And if you look historically on the downfall of strong men, you see that repeatedly. There was no one in the room to tell them they were making a dumb move.
You know, this might be implicit, but let's go back to Mark Ellis, the director of the International Bar Association. And Mark, can you tell us what the internal and external threats are that are uniquely posed by strongmen leaders? Why should we be so worried about them?
Well, I think some of our colleagues have alluded to this, but I think that authoritarian rules, these strongmen, their actions impact just the very foundation of a liberal society. And for our audience, I'm not speaking about liberal versus conservative thought. I'm speaking of liberalism in a much more classical way. It's about equality, individual liberty, accountability, fairness of law, the rule of law. And strongmen know that to survive, they have to destroy this structure. So the basic benchmarks of the rule of law and independent judiciary, free press, civil society, they're attacked and they're destroyed. So that's internally what happens, and it happens, I think, consistently. I think that's part of the playbook that Paul alludes to. Externally, and again, David and Shannon, I think, said this best as well, they really do pursue aggressive foreign policies, and it's characterized by kind of an us versus them mentality. It's draped in xenophobia and really venomous intolerance and hatred of others. And in this view, there's not opponents, they're just traitors, and global stability is really dismantled. And of course, Putin personifies this approach more than any other leader.
So I'm wondering if they're always bad for the United States. Paul Williams, you're our international peace negotiator. Think back to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He used to say that the United States, it's in its interest to support certain strongmen leaders as long as there are strongmen leaders, as long as there are allies. Do you agree with that assessment?
No.
Okay, tell us.
Michael, nothing good comes of a warm hug for a strongman. They start wars that undermine our genuine strategic interests. They dilute a global liberal order that protects our political and our economic interests. And most importantly, they erode human rights norms that are genuinely at the core of America's identity. With friends like that, you don't need adversaries. So no, we should stop our warm hugs of strongmen and embrace our democratic allies.
Now, sometimes these strongmen tend to hang on to power for a really, really long time. Shannon French, let me ask you, do you think that the strongmen model of ruling a country is inherently flawed and prone to break down?
Well, it's certainly unstable. And the reason it's unstable is that because these people tend to surround themselves with other people who also have bad character, the loyalty of their supporters is generally not solid. They can be lured to other leaders. They can be bought off. And more often, they want the power too. So the second that the strong man shows any weakness, someone is waiting there to try to take that over. And it was also mentioned earlier the point about children of some of these strong men. And of course, we've seen a very mixed bag with that sometimes they try to pass things along to their children, but their children are not as successful or not as charismatic, or all of these things come to pass. So they lose that very weak hold that they had that was never based in truly shared values, let alone the legitimacy of democracy.
All right. Well, I think we've now made the case for why it is not in the U.S. interest to embrace the strongmen, but rather the U.S. should oppose the strongmen phenomenon. I teased her presence at the beginning of the hour. Now let's bring on our star, Ambassador Van Schaak, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Criminal Justice. Beth, welcome to the conversation, and I have this question for you. If, as was discussed earlier, there is a roadmap that strongmen take to transform their countries, is there a counter roadmap for the international community to take to respond to them? What are the options for holding strongmen accountable under international and domestic law? I think nobody in the world is more qualified to answer that question than you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed this. And indeed, there are a number of tools and mechanisms that we have. I just want to acknowledge the role that civil society plays in these communities and the importance of the international community supporting democratic institutions. We've talked about how, I think it was Greg who raised it, that these can be real guardrails against efforts by strongmen to take power and then to erode or otherwise commandeer the national institutions in order to maintain that power and to engage in self-enrichment, et cetera, that we know strongmen do. We also, of course, have a whole system of international law. When we're dealing with authoritarian regimes, there are human rights obligations that earlier administrations may have taken on. That means that claims can be brought against those states before treaty-based bodies in Geneva and elsewhere if they're breaching those international human rights treaties. But we also have international criminal law. So if violence rises to a certain level, it would be considered, for example, war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide. And we have seen that so many of the strongmen who we've mentioned and strong women who we've mentioned in this call, on this show, have eventually been brought to justice. So Slobodan Milosevic, for example, Charles Taylor, we have David Crane here, of course, Fujimori of Peru, Laurent Gbagbo, Hissen Habre of Chad. So many of these former strongmen and women were eventually brought to justice. Sometimes that happens in their own system. So Fujimori is a great example of that, where there is some sort of a political transformation that happens and the individual is suddenly recognized for the criminal that they were. Sometimes it happens before an international tribunal. So the United Nations may create a tribunal, as happened for Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Sierra Leone. In other cases, you may have a hybrid tribunal where the national system gets support from the international community to stand up a tribunal. And this can include seconded individuals like David who serve alongside their national counterparts in order to bring these individuals to justice in the national system, but with a lot of international investment and assistance. And beyond these sort of legal measures, we have much more robust now sanctions regimes that can also be utilized. And I really want to emphasize the point about the link between corruption and mass atrocities or violence against civilians. So often we see these two phenomena going hand in hand, and in many respects, they sort of reinforce each other. You know, these strong men will use corruption to gain and maintain power, and then they want to stay there, so they use violence in order to hold power and get access to natural resources, which then continue to fill their own personal coffers. And we see a very interesting phenomenon in some of these societies where oftentimes, because of the techniques that they use to maintain power that we've talked about, creating these mythical or imagined foes, internal or external, oftentimes there are segments of the population that do consider them sort of heroes against terrorism, for example, or heroes against insurrection. But as soon as the facts emerge that these individuals were actually the whole time lining their own pockets, suddenly the idea of accountability becomes much more appealing. And you end up seeing huge levels of support for accountability for these former strongmen, either in their own national systems or in international institutions. And so Augusto Pinochet is a classic example of this, right? He painted himself as the savior of the nation, right, against this leftist insurrection, et cetera. And there were swaths of the population that believed that narrative and saw him as taking this very defensive approach. Ultimately, what he was prosecuted for when he finally did return to Chile was more in the nature of corruption charges. Now, ultimately, he died while many of these proceedings were in process, so this does often happen many years later. But we do see this link, and it's, in my work, I often take a sort of Al Capone approach, like, whatever these guys, whatever we can get them on, let's use existing legal authorities to fullest effect.
And for anybody in our audience that doesn't remember the history of the U.S., Al Capone ended up being successfully prosecuted for tax evasion, not the hundreds and hundreds of people he killed as a gangster in Chicago, but it got him off the streets. Let me say, for our ambassador, the U.S. is the only country that has an ambassador-at-large position for international criminal justice, and I think that says an awful lot about our country that we have that as a priority. Thank you for your insights. We'll come back to you in a minute. Let me turn now to Mark Ellis. Ambassador Van Schaak mentioned civil society. From your perspective as director of one of the world's largest non-governmental organizations, what can the NGO community do to help respond to strongmen?
Well, it's exactly what Beth said. I think her focus on civil society to me is key. And I think in the short and medium term, international NGOs supporting civil society within the countries where strongmen lead is absolutely critical. And we've seen this time and time again. I certainly saw it in my time in former Eastern Europe before 1989, and then during the transition through 1989. The civil society was the catalyst. And you can look at whether it's Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia, and his involvement with Charter 77, or Lech Walesa Solidarity Movement. Civil society is often the catalyst to change. And so I think international NGOs, international community should double its efforts in supporting civil society actors everywhere. But in the long term, Michael, this to me is critical. It's all about education. An educated populace is fundamental to countering the rise of strongmen. And I've always said there's a clear correlation, an inverse one, between educational attainment and awareness and support of nationalist parties and governments and movements. So the level of education, I think, it's a predicator to popular support. A higher level of education and civic awareness, I think, ensures a more liberal, multicultural worldview. So the focus long-term should always be increasing education.
Now, Mark, Ambassador Van Schaak also mentioned economic sanctions, but let me ask, they didn't seem to work against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They didn't seem to work against Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. When do you think, Mark, sanctions are most likely to work against strongmen, and when are they least likely?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think sanctions have always had a mixed result when utilized to kind of counter strongmen. I support targeted sanctions, but we have to recognize they also have a human toll. They can often be devastating, causing people in the very country that you're trying to alter, change, to turn against you. But I do think that they work with kind of careful consideration, and when they're supported by a significant number of states. There has to be robust coordination. So in short, it's really multilateral support is vital for effective sanctions. Okay. And isolated sanctions fail.
So let me just ask about use of force. Shannon, if we can't dislodge people through economic sanctions, then we always think about using force. But how does the U.S. ensure that it doesn't leave a country worse off when it responds to a strongman with military intervention, as in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan?
It's a great question, Michael. And unfortunately, as you all know, historically, we don't have the best track record here, at least, shall we say, recently. You have to go back to post-World War II to find sense of successful rebuilding of nations. And there we're going right back to what Beth and Mark were talking about. The focus needed to be then and needs to be again on civil society and also education.
All right. Well, there's so many more questions I'd love to be asking our panel on these issues, but it's time to bring our program to a close. So I'd like to thank our experts for helping us understand the strongman phenomenon and the threat it poses. Beth Van Schaak, Mark Ellis, David Crane, Greg Noon, Paul Williams, and Shannon French, thank you all for providing your insights about this important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy, a production of Case Western Reserve University and Idea Stream Public Media, heard here on 89.7 WKSU. Thanks for tuning in.